Today we are talking to Andrew Lawler, the author of Why Did the Chicken Cross the World? The Epic Saga of the Bird That Powered Civilization. Thank you very much for your time, and we're looking forward to hearing more about the book and you as well.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Can you give us a little bit insight in why this topic was interesting to you, and how did you come about writing this book?
Well, it was completely unexpected. I am not, or was not interested in chickens. I was not interested in farm animals. I'm a science writer. I've written about all kinds of aspects of science, from astronomy to zoology, and I didn't really know much about chickens. In fact, the thing I focused on mostly is archaeology in the past decade or so. And I've traveled to digs around the world writing about finds that archaeologists had made. But one day I went to the editor at a magazine and I pitched a story about Bronze Age sailors sailing from India to Arabia. There had been a new archaeological find in Oman, which sounded interesting, and I thought that would be a great story. And the editor was interested, but he said, but, well, what did they bring? Because these were people who sailed from India about 4,000 years ago to Arabia. And I said, well, they brought lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. They brought timber from the Himalayas and all kinds of resources. And he said, well, what else? And I dug around and I found out that they had actually found a chicken bone among the archaeological remains. So I said, oh, and they apparently brought chickens. And I guess chickens hadn't been in the West before. And he said, now that's interesting. Follow the chicken. I said, excuse me? He said, follow the chicken. Find out what the chicken is. How did it get to be the animal that's so important? And, what is it? And I said, no, I don't do livestock. I'm a science writer. So that was the beginning of the journey.
So in your journey, did you find the chickens originated in India or some other part of the world?
Well, I went to Oman to find the place where this chicken bone had been found. And when I got there, having traveled halfway around the world, I discovered from the archaeology team that, in fact, that bone was not an ancient chicken bone. It was a new chicken bone. In fact, it was from a workman's lunch, and it had been misclassified. So at that point, it was a rather difficult situation I was in, since I'd been halfway around the world to find the first chicken to come to the West, only to find out that it was actually the lunch of an Omani workman. So I did go to India after that, and I did start to pick up the trail of where the chicken came from and what it is. And pretty soon, to my astonishment, I found myself completely fascinated by an animal that I'd never given much thought to.
The chicken is ubiquitous. It's almost everywhere, so we take it for granted and we don't understand the importance of it, that how it translated from the celebration or religious events or religious ceremonies to the commerce.
Yes, indeed. That was one of the big surprises I found in doing my research, was that the chicken, which today, of course, when you call somebody a chicken, is an insult. It means they're a coward. But to my surprise, in many parts of the world today, and in much of the ancient world, the chicken was actually considered a sacred animal, a sacred symbol, and was used more frequently in sacrifices, religious sacrifices, around the world in more different cultures than any other single animal that I could find. So it's rather astonishing. In fact, I discovered that according to many anthropologists who've studied the chicken, it looks as if the chicken was domesticated not for its meat, but for its religious sacrificial purposes. And that leads to the next issue around how the chicken is used, which isn't talked about much anymore, and that's cockfighting.
Mm-hmm. Primarily in Philippines and Thailand, and that part of Asia is quite popular, this cockfighting.
Yeah, cockfighting, in fact, began probably in the place where the chicken was first domesticated. That is, as you mentioned, Thailand, probably in Southeast Asia. The chicken is actually the red jungle fowl. The chicken is the same species as what's called the red jungle fowl, which is the wild chicken, because all animals, domesticated animals, come from a wild animal, obviously. Now, most people know about say, where cows come from, from ancient oxen. And we know about a lot of animals. Dogs come from wolves. But most people, including me, I didn't know that the chicken came from the red jungle fowl. And so the question is, how did this wild bird, which is actually a very shy and beautiful bird, a pheasant, kind of pheasant that lives in the jungles of Southeast Asia, how did it become the it bird? How did it become the single most popular bird in the world today and the single most important bird for us today?
Mm-hmm. And how did that happen? If you can trace that.
I thought you would never ask. Well, how it happened was that I mentioned a religious aspect of this. That the chicken was considered. It was actually a bird that meshed very well with humans. That they began to move from hunter-gatherers to people who farmed for a living. If you farmed for a living, you would clear a field, and you had those pesky weeds to deal with. Well, the red jungle fowl likes to eat certain weeds, particularly bamboo, that springs up when you cut down a field in, say, Southeast Asia. So at the same time, red jungle fowl don't like to eat grain. They don't like wheat or barley or rice, the staples that farmers tend to grow. And so as a result, the red jungle fowl didn't compete with humans for food. In other words, it wasn't one of those noxious birds that was trying to steal the grain, like, say, crows. Instead, it was actually eating the weeds and the bugs, because red jungle fowl love all kinds of bugs. They're eating the bugs, eating the weeds, not eating the grain. Hey, what a great animal to have around. So eventually, the bird began to hang out around where humans lived in villages in Southeast Asia. And at some point, they became domesticated. We don't really know exactly how or when, but it looks like, based on the current research, it looks as if probably people began to capture, take the eggs or capture the bird in the forest or on the edge of the field and bring them into the village and put them in cages, and then they were trained to fight. And probably these were sacred fights. You would pit two cocks against one another, two roosters against one another. And these animals can be very, very fierce if their territory is threatened. They're not naturally aggressive, but only when they are faced with an aggressor, they will fight very, very hard. And so these became religious rituals around cockfighting. And probably that's the origin. It wasn't until much later that you had people who were raising chickens solely for their meat and eggs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So is it safe to say that we don't know the exact region where it originated, except that it was somewhere in Southeast Asia in the red jungle that you found them in the first time? Yeah,
it's very difficult to pinpoint, because today when you look at the DNA from chickens today, chickens have been passed all over the world. Therefore, my title, which is Why Did the Chicken Cross the World? The chicken has crossed the world over and over again in so many different eras, in so many different ways, carried on the backs of peasants in China who, were moving north, or carried on ships, or carried across the whole Pacific Ocean by the Polynesians who used the chicken quite religiously for many purposes. So you had the chicken that was extremely useful for not just for fighting and religious purposes, but eventually it becomes an animal that people realize also can lay a lot of eggs, and also then much, much later could become a source of meat.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So over the centuries, the chickens have been found as a friendly companion for humans, and they have been using the friendship for farming to any other purposes, and now it's mostly for the meat purposes. Has there been any other beneficial reasons other than that they also cross the world? I mean, there's not a single place where you would not find chicken, probably except Antarctica, because of they want to protect those local certain animals there, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. The penguins there, they're concerned that penguins will get chicken diseases, avian flu, for example, which could wipe out the penguins of Antarctica. Although there are signs that even in Antarctica, there are some chicken viruses that have spread among penguins for reasons that we don't understand. But yes, Antarctica is the only place in the world where chicken is actually banned. It's illegal. Vatican City is the only country that I could find that doesn't have chickens. It's too small to fit the chicken coop. And Pope Francis, who eats chicken, I understand, he gets it from the markets in Rome right there. So the chicken has become ubiquitous, but originally, its original range, the wild chicken, the red jungle fowl we were talking about earlier, it ranged all the way from Pakistan in the mountains and the foothills of the Himalayas, all the way through the Himalayas in India, and then down into Southeast Asia, and then up a little into China, southern China. So to actually pinpoint the place where domestication took place, we don't have the science yet to do that, and there's big arguments right now in the literature about whether the chicken was domesticated once in one place, say in southern China or northern Vietnam possibly, or northern Thailand, or whether it happened in many places in different times. In other words, it might have happened in Pakistan, it might have happened at the same time or slightly earlier in Southeast Asia. We don't really know, but the important point is that this bird, which seemed like the last creature in the world that could be domesticated because it's incredibly shy. I met some of the purebred red jungle fowl that some of the few that still exist in the United States that are in particular zoos and collections, and they're incredibly skittish. They're so terrified of humans that often they will have a heart attack and die if you try to pick one up.
Oh.
So you can see how much over time we have altered the chicken to suit our needs. We want it to be a fighter. Well, it can be a fighter. We want it to hang around our barnyards and eat the food waste. Well, it can do that, and it can convert those into eggs and meat. The chicken is genetically incredibly flexible, incredibly plastic. It can change its shape, size, color, and even way of being to suit what we want. That's what makes the chicken so unusual.
Would you like to trace a little bit of history of how chickens cross the world and where the paths have been and along each destination, if there was any substantial change along the way, so that way at least the readers have an idea that how this jungle fowl has become a kind of meat of favorite around the world, because obviously cattle were far more expensive to slaughter every time than the chickens. I guess they were cheaper.
Right. And so the chicken spread, but probably for the first few thousand years, say until maybe ancient Rome, till around 2,000 years ago. Primarily, the chicken was spread around for cockfighting. Cockfighting was incredibly popular throughout the ancient world, in both China as well as in Southeast Asia, and then in Europe and in parts of Southwest Asia. So cockfighting is probably how the chicken was first spread around the world. So you had a prize cock that beat the cock in the village next door. Then a trader is coming through selling something, and he buys your rooster for a large amount of money because prize cocks are very valuable. And then he takes it to the next village or to the next town, and then that rooster has its own baby roosters, and through a local hen, and then the prize fighting cock would be carried further. So you have a chain that probably was about people trading what was not a cheap food that was $1.99 a pound at the supermarket, but rather was a very exotic commodity that was very expensive. In fact, today, fighting cocks can sell for several $1,000s each in places like the Philippines, where cockfighting is still legal. So probably in those the beginning of the chicken spread, it was this exotic bird which people loved because it was beautiful, very colorful. It had all kinds of red and gold colors in the original red jungle fowl. And some of the older chickens that you see, the older varieties you see in Southeast Asia, look very much like the wild chicken. And so the feathers were very valuable. Used them for cockfighting and then for religious purposes, as I mentioned earlier. So by the time it got to, let's say, crossing into Europe, that would be, by the time it gets into Greece, it's probably around the 7th century or 6th century BC. That's when we first get images of chickens in Europe. And what we know is at that time in Mesopotamia, the chicken was considered to be a sacred symbol of both the sun and the moon. The rooster represented the sun, and the hen represented the moon. And these were actually quite sacred animals. They were worshipped. We had images of priests actually bowing down and offering offerings to a rooster sitting on a pedestal. And that's a theme that's repeated through history right into Christian time. So clearly this idea of the chicken as sacred moved probably from Southeast Asia to India through Persia, where Zoroastrianism was the primary religion at the time. They're the people that invented Easter eggs. And they believed that the chicken was this beast that was able to call out the beginning of light, the coming of light. So it was, of course, nature's alarm clock, right? And people took it a step further, and they saw the chicken, in fact, as a kind of spiritual alarm clock. It was the bird that called you to wake up. And so Zoroaster and the tradition that followed him believed very strongly that the rooster was a sacred animal. By the time it gets to Greece, same thing. The rooster is seen as incredibly important both for healing purposes as well as, and I don't mean just chicken soup, but also if you got well, you would sacrifice a chicken because the god of healing believed that the chicken was one of his prime animals. So it's fascinating. It was fascinating to me to see how these traditions stretching all the way from Southeast Asia into Europe are connected. And they're connected not because of meat and eggs, but they're connected by the religious importance that's attached to the chicken.
And how did that religious importance eventually die out or lost its significance over the years?
Well, it probably reached its peak in, I would say, in early medieval Europe, where you had popes who decreed that the chicken was sacred. In fact, the chicken was so important that it had to be placed on every steeple in Christendom.
Oh.
Now, we don't really think about this, but when you see a weather vane, which has a rooster on top, why is it a rooster?
Right.
And the rooster is up there because early Christians believed that the rooster was calling us to awaken from our spiritual slumber. It was calling us to go to church. It was calling us back to communion with God. And this is associated with a New Testament passage which mentions Peter denying Christ 3 times before the cock crowed. That was what Jesus predicted. It came true in the Gospels. But if you look at what was going on before, it's very, very part and parcel of the tradition around the chicken, that the rooster is the animal that awakens us. So the top of St. Peter's Basilica, the old St. Peter's, the most important church in all of the Christian world, was topped with a giant rooster, which is actually still on display in the treasury of the Vatican. But by the 16th century, things had changed, and there was concern that the chicken might not be a very moral creature. There was a lot of concern about sexual morals. And as people began to get worried about morality in the realm of the erotic, they began to look at the chicken as evil. So it's fascinating. By the 15th and 16th century, suddenly you have the rooster appearing as images of the devil. The devil is seen as a kind of rooster, very lecherous and aggressive and nasty. And so slowly the chicken began to lose its religious significance as a positive symbol and became instead a symbol of actual evil and was reviled by many people. And at the same time, then chickens began to be used more frequently for their meat and eggs as populations began to grow in Europe, starting in the 16th and 17th centuries. But I should add that in places like Bali, where I went, the chicken is still considered quite sacred. and they still have sacred cockfights that take place before any major ritual in a temple.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So this isn't just a dead idea that, oh, the chicken thousands of years ago was worshipped. No, it's nothing like that. It's a living tradition that continues today in many parts of the world, where in Africa, in parts of Southeast Asia, in Polynesia, and other places where the chicken is still held in very high esteem. In fact, in Brooklyn,
yeah, I think
in Brooklyn itself, because among Jews, certain traditional Jews in Brooklyn believe, the Lubavitchers in particular, they believe that you use a chicken, swing a chicken around your head several times while saying a prayer on the eve of Yom Kippur, and that will cleanse your soul. That will cleanse you of sin. And this is still practiced, and I went and witnessed it myself. It's fascinating to talk to rabbis about their differing understandings and interpretations of what's going on. But what's clear is that the chicken is seen as a religious symbol, as a very important animal that is sacred.
The modern day of chicken farming and then slaughtering and trading of meat is a little bit cruel in many ways on the chickens. Generally, chickens live as much as between 10 and 20 years, but I don't think they can survive that long in those cages. Any perspective on that, what you've discovered as you were going through your book writing process?
Well, I have to say, after doing all this travel and talking to Balinese priests and to Polynesians and to people in Africa who are very focused on the importance of the chicken as an animal that performs a ritual function, it was kind of shocking to discover that in the United States, the chicken is actually not considered an animal under U.S. law. Let me explain. If you are growing the chicken for food, the chicken is not protected by any animal regulations. Any regulations that would protect an animal from harm or from cruelty do not apply to the chicken if it's used for food. Now, if a chicken's in a circus or in some other non-food role, then that's different. But if a chicken is being grown for food, it is considered basically a vegetable. And I found this really disturbing because after all I learned about the sacred quality of the chicken over so many generations across so many different societies, not just one or two, but dozens of societies, I found it deeply disturbing, even upsetting, that the chicken has absolutely no protections today in our modern industrial society that uses chickens more than any other animal to provide protein for people.
Yeah, I think only a few states have banned now the cockfight, but or is it most of the states that have banned the cockfight?
Well, cockfighting, it's interesting because cockfighting first was banned in England in the 1850s or so, 1840s, 1850s. And that is exactly the same time that the chicken was, the modern chicken was coming into existence. And what I mean by that is that in the 1840s, England was fighting the Opium War with China, the first Opium War. And the English were trying to force open the Chinese markets, and they succeeded. And one of the things they got out of China that they had not seen before was the Chinese chicken varieties, which were very large and very regal and very hardy. And these birds astonished Queen Victoria. She actually received several of these from a British naval captain. And she's the one that began the modern chicken. Modern chicken began with Queen Victoria, who created her own special chicken coop to house these birds in the 1840s, and then she hired somebody to help breed them with English chickens, and they began to come up with these varieties that were quite beautiful and stunning in their colors, and it became a craze. Everybody wanted a Chinese chicken or a Chinese crossbred chicken. And they sold for fantastic sums. And that interest spread across to the United States. So by the 1850s, chickens were incredibly popular, these kind of exotic eastern chickens. And of course, that fad burned itself out. But the result was that by bringing together eastern chickens with western chickens, you produced a new kind of chicken, which was larger and hardier and better tempered than the European birds, which had been kind of scrawny and not really worth growing for meat. They were worth it for eggs, but not really for meat. So it was kind of food for the poor back then. Eating chicken meant that you were poor in Europe in the 16th or 15th centuries. So it all changed, and this new chicken came about, which is basically designed to feed the masses, designed to produce an egg a day, designed to grow for 16 weeks, and then be slaughtered for its meat. This is a completely new phenomenon that we have never seen in the world when it comes to chickens. The Romans were big on growing chickens, but usually their farms had no more than, say, 200 or so, and they weren't done on the kind of mass scale you see today. So it's a brand new game, and it's a very different chicken from what we had just 150 years ago.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In the is the commerce aspect of the chicken was responsible for certain events in West Africa as well. I believe there was some cattle farming that got completely changed after the chicken became very popular.
Yeah, this was a great story I stumbled on. I found a young researcher, a young archaeologist who's been working in Burkina Faso in Central Africa, West Central Africa. And he discovered through his digs that there was a society that had been a cattle society. And that society was traditional African cattle society, or like any cattle society, hierarchical. That is, you have families that own large herds. So it tends to be a kind of society where there are a few large wealthy families and then a lot of basically small farmers. That changed completely. At some point in this one little village that he dug, he found that at a certain point there was a revolution. It was a chicken revolution. People got rid of the cow, no more cattle are found, and instead everyone suddenly has chickens. And as soon as people had chickens, the society changed. If you wanted to sacrifice something to the gods, and you weren't wealthy, you couldn't afford to buy a cow. You couldn't afford to kill a cow, but you could do it with a chicken. Everybody could afford a chicken. So everybody had chickens, and everybody could participate in the religious rituals, and suddenly the society became far more egalitarian. And I think this is a really important and fascinating point about the chicken, which has relevance today, that the chicken can provide even very small farmers with the ability to survive and the ability to provide the kinds of minerals and vitamins that young children need that can be provided, particularly with eggs. Meat is good, but the eggs are really what is critical at that age. So the bird has had a tremendous effect, not just on how we eat, but also on how society itself is shaped.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Switching the gears here a little bit, would you help us for our readers a little bit more background on you? And you've been writing science-related books, and how did you end up writing books? What brought you to be an author?
Well, I've been a reporter, journalist for 30 years, and began as a reporter in Washington, and I began to cover science programs. I covered the space program in different parts of the world as well as the United States, covered space shuttle launches, went to Russia and China to cover their space programs, and then eventually I'd pretty much written every story I could think of that I wanted to write, and I did a year of a fellowship at MIT and Harvard, and in that year I had the joy of being able to take any class I wanted. So I took an archaeology class and realized that, wow, archaeology is something I've always really loved, but I've never known much about, and I'm a journalist, so I could write about it. So I found myself in Baghdad the following year at a conference in 2001, I believe, and was introduced to the whole world of Middle Eastern archaeology, which, of course, is a rich area, not just in the in terms of the past, but also in terms of the present, because there's obviously so much happening there. So I began focusing on covering the Middle East and going to digs and learning more about the people that had lived there, as well as, of course, the people that live there today. And that's what led me kind of sideways to this story of the chicken. So my real interest has been in how humans created the world we live in. Why do we have these iPhones and live in cities and drive cars? Where does this all come from? And my real intellectual interest has been to uncover the reasons why humans became an urban species. And so, strangely, the chicken turned out to be a way to tell that story. I wouldn't have thought that, but that's what appeared. The chicken reflects so much who we are that by telling the story of the chicken, I'm actually telling the story of how civilization develops and spreads around the world. So, I found that following your interest can lead you in very unexpected places. And the last thing I thought I'd be doing is interviewing a Balinese priest about his use of chickens in religious rituals. Yet it seemed to fit in pretty neatly with what I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How long it took you to write the book, and how was the research process? How many trips did you end up doing, or how many people were involved? Or if you could enlighten our readers what it took you or what you had to go through to finish the book.
Well, I had already done a fair amount of research for this article I did, or a cover story I did for Smithsonian magazine. So I already had a good deal of research under my belt, but when I actually began to dig into the topic, I was completely overwhelmed because the story of the chicken spans 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years across virtually every continent except for Antarctica, and even Antarctica gets mentioned. So it was overwhelming to consider the number of stories and information, scientific information, the historical, the religious implications. All of these things really forced me to find a way to tell the story that unfolded in a sequential way. So, in other words, I used time as my pathway to take the reader. I start at the beginning. I start with the red jungle fowl, and then I unravel the tale as I begin to travel and move around the world and visit different places. But I didn't want it to be a dry history, which is why I traveled. I traveled and I write about the people I met. I met with, I mentioned Balinese priests. I went to ancient DNA labs in Australia, where there's important work being done on the spread of the chicken across Polynesia, which is a story that's not really been told. I went to labs in Europe, went to places in Britain to research Queen Victoria's role in the chicken. I went to universities in the United States and doing research on when chickens are happy. How do you actually house chickens in a way that makes them happy? Not according to how we think, but according to how they think. They're really exciting, cutting-edge research that has big implications for the way we treat this animal. So I tried to really, I went around the world, quite literally, to see who I could find who really understood this bird. I talked with people in northern Vietnam who actually had lived with red jungle fowl that had been brought from the wild and understood them. And that was great. A man who was, of course, didn't even speak Vietnamese. He spoke the local language up there, but through translators, I was able to get some of his wisdom. So it was really finding people, not just experts, but people who were familiar with this animal in a way that I think others would consider interesting, and I certainly found surprising.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So how long it took you to finish the book?
It took me a year from the time I actually signed the contract to the time I delivered the manuscript. That said, I was already doing travel and research even before I got the contract because I was hooked. I was in it, and I knew that the book was that I would find a publisher. I had no doubt. So I dived into it. So I'd say it was really probably 2 years, given the work I'd done previously, 2 years of pretty solid research. I did a little freelancing on the side. That's my job as well. But mostly I focused on this, and it was wonderful to have a single project to focus on like this. And it brought me the kind of joy that you rarely experience in doing a 2,000-word magazine piece.
What is chicken? I mean, everybody knows chicken, but do they have certain intelligence? Do they have certain recognizing abilities? Can they recognize human? Can they listen? Can they hear? Are there certain attributes or features that they have that most people don't know about?
Well, that's just the question I asked. And to answer that, I went to a university in Italy where an Italian researcher has done some of the most interesting work on chicken behavior to try and understand are chickens smart? And he said to me, and he was not entirely joking, that we were standing in the basement of a laboratory. It was in an old convent, and it was this enormous basement where he had the lab set up, and it was filled with baby chickens. And they were doing experiments with baby chickens. And I mean chickens that had hatched maybe a day or 2 days before. So these were very young chickens, and they're doing very simple experiments of just, nothing cruel. It was all just simple behavioral stuff of would a chicken move in one direction toward food or another, and it was they were very simple experiments. But what he concluded was that even chickens just out of the egg, who've not even had coaching by a parent, they already had the ability to do math. They have the ability to do deductive logic, that they actually are incredibly intelligent. In fact, he said, in some of these tests, my grad students didn't perform as well on some days. And he was only half joking. And I think there's little question that this animal is remarkably intelligent. And that, of course, is the reason why it's been so able to adapt to the changing needs that humans keep throwing at the chicken. It knows how to alter its behavior in ways that are quite remarkable. So, I found this astonishing that we really do know through very hardcore scientific experiments that the chicken has, even young chicks at a very early age, have a very high level of intelligence. And I think this has big implications for how we treat this animal, or it should have big implications for how we treat this animal.
We found dogs to be the best companion, and we found many other birds to be useful companions. But why chicken hasn't been exploited, so to speak, or used for their smartness or intelligence by the humans? Or are humans not intelligent enough to understand that?
Well, you could say that if the chicken reflects who we are, then the fact that we cage chickens in such huge numbers and give them very little light and minimal decent way of life might say something great indeed about how we treat each other. But I think that we have used the chicken for its intelligence. I think that as terrible as cockfighting is at one level, at another level, it showed a respect for this animal. That's a controversial statement, I know, but I actually went to some cockfights, and it was a difficult thing to do because of the cruelty involved. But I also understood that the people involved have an understanding of the bird that is far different from the typical American consumer who goes in and all they know of chicken is if it's on sale today. So I think humans have made use of the bird according to our particular needs of the moment. And our needs of the moment are not religious, primarily. Our needs of the moment are, we have billions of people on the planet. We need to feed them. And the chicken is providing an incredible service in allowing us to have the protein we need so that our societies can function. And so I understand that. I understand the need for humans to eat. And I think we need to balance that with our new understanding of both what the chicken is today, that is an intelligent creature, and the history that is behind the chicken, that is so wrapped up with human history that I think it's a terrible idea that we would continue to treat the chicken the way we do, knowing now what we do about both the way it is now and the way it has served us in the past.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Are you
And I say that as somebody who's not I don't consider myself an animal rights activist. I'm a science journalist. I didn't come into this with any agenda. I was not interested in an agenda. I was interested in taking a personal journey into what is chicken and bringing back a story for readers who could both enjoy it and learn something from it.
Makes a lot of sense. Are you working on any other fascinating projects that our readers should look forward to in the new book titles or the new subjects that you care to discuss?
I am. Well, I should mention that Why Did the Chicken Cross the World is going to paperback on April 26th. Simon & Schuster's Atria imprint will be publishing the paperback, so I'm delighted with that and hope to have a chance to talk more about chickens in the months to come. But I've also just submitted a new book proposal to several publishers, and I'm planning to go to New York next week, as a matter of fact, to talk with them about it. I can't talk to you about the topic, but I will say it's a really exciting mystery that I'm hoping to solve that involves American history. And it's been great fun, and I'm already deep into it, but I'm still keeping one foot, as it were, in the chicken world.
Well, thank you very much for your time and your comments, and please keep us in mind when you're ready with your next book.
Great. I certainly will, Manish. Thanks for the chat. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.